he's here to answer questions. Can he reassure the House that since Kabatu was released, no other asylum-seeking offender has been accidentally let out of prison? It's a clear question. Can he give an answer?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Get a grip, man. I know I'm the Justice Secretary. That's why I'm at the dispatch box, also as Deputy Prime Minister. We know that.
For the first time in my life, I am actually ashamed to be British. We have become a laughingstock. I think it must be the most clownish behaviour that the House of Commons has ever seen.
I thought it was embarrassing. Nobody trusts David Lammy to sort of utter a statement. But clearly I don't think he trusts the people that are briefing him either.
Lammy is not simply that modern title of Justice Secretary. He is Lord Chancellor. That is the office held by Sir Thomas More. Can you imagine a clown like that occupying their position?
Hello, and welcome to David Starkey Talks with the indomitable David Starkey, and presenting, today at least, is me, Benedict Spence. David, thank you so much for having me again. It's good to see you.
A great pleasure.
Now, as much as it is a great pleasure to see you, sadly it's not a particularly pleasurable time to be in the United Kingdom these days, with our current political situation being what it is.
It is, you could actually say, Benedict, I would like to put this firmly on the table. For the first time in my life, I am actually ashamed to be British. We have become a laughingstock. The events, the political events of the last few days and the events surrounding the release of prisoners, the grotesque performances in the House of Commons, the absurd disjunction of the Prime Minister shooting off and leading somebody that I think we can only describe as an ass as our Deputy Prime Minister. I am ashamed.
I mean, it should speak volumes that you'd use that sort of language, in response to the current goings-on in the country. But I think we should just dive down very quickly before we sort of get into the furore of the House of Commons. I mean, what does that say fundamentally about the ability of a state to perform its basic functions if the sort of the cornerstone, which is the upholding of law and order and the implication of justice, they cannot even keep people in prison who are supposed to be there? They lose people, they send the wrong ones to different courts. And we're only learning now, because of a particularly high-profile case, just how commonplace it is. What does that say about the current state of the state to perform its basic functions?
I think it says everything. I mean, and again, you've given that big, powerful overview. One of the ways I think that we can best illustrate it by very simple numbers as opposed to rhetoric. Very often numbers are better than rhetoric. We are at the moment under Labour. We've seen a 129% increase in wrong releases, and we are now releasing one prisoner every day wrongly. In other words, this is not isolated. This is systemic. It is. You also used, I think, really proper language at that point. You talked about the basic functions of the state. We had, not very long ago, a coronation. It was a rather shambolic coronation, but there was still enough of the traditional material there to tell you what the classic view of the state of a kingdom was. And the king swears an oath, and the centre of that oath is to do justice and to uphold the law. That is the fundamental purpose of the state, that and to defend the state. And what we've seen is a collapse of those two things. Our army is risible. I've had conversations with senior officers who say effectively our nuclear deterrent is semi-non-functioning, and they're being polite about it. And at the same time, the fundamental rule of the state, the rule of law, the decision of a judge, acts as a kind of proxy for the actual monarch in his duty to uphold law as the foundation of any legitimate state is law. That's what it is. And we've abandoned it. And we have, as one forgets, Lammy is not simply that modern title of Justice Secretary. He is Lord Chancellor. That is the office held by Sir Thomas More. That is the office held by Cardinal Wolsey. Can you imagine a clown like that occupying their positions? But there's something, we've been blaming Labour. I've been blaming Labour. They deserve blame. And this perpetual business of shuffling it off, oh, it was the Conservatives. But Benedict, you and I are on the right. We need to put our hands up too. This collapse in justice is very largely due to the decisions, the absurd, I would actually use the word criminal decisions, taken by David Cameron and by George Osborne in 2010, when you decide we will have this thing called austerity. They needed to stabilize the finances. Let's be completely clear about this. The Labour government of 1997 to 2010 destroyed the most productive period of the British economy since the Second World War. And you will remember the famous note that the Secretary of the Treasury handed over to his successor. Byrne hands that note over saying, there's no more money. So they had to do something. But what did they choose to do? They chose to protect our NHS. And do you remember the other department?
No, I don't. It certainly wasn't education, was it?
Foreign aid.
Oh, of course.
Foreign
That
aid.
little thing. Yeah.
This was the height of Cameronism. This was the height of the Nice Party. This was the height of conservatism, that is to be friendly to every liberal and to every liberal prejudice and belief. This is the party that, welcomed all those sweet young women that hadn't a thought in their heads but had got rather nice hair, that were recruited by Cameron in his MPs in 2010. And what was the sacrifice? Every other department was salami cut, including justice. And this is what's happened. And I had a stand-up row with George Osborne, I remember it vividly, in 2012 on exactly this issue. And I predicted what would happen. In other words, if you're faced with a financial crisis, then, as we are now with Rachel Reeves, you cannot say, we will simply cut or we will minimally finance everything. You have to choose. Politics is about choosing. You've got to say what are areas that we will protect and what are areas effectively that you say the state should simply withdraw from. An obvious example was foreign aid, and an obvious example that not only requires protection but requires abundant funding is justice. And there's been, again, going right back to Blair and to Brown, under Blair and Brown, there were again all these vague notions of altering punitive justice, of shifts to some form of redistributive, some form of ameliorative, all of these things. And the basic function of the state to enforce criminal justice and the need for it to be dignified, the need for it to carry awe, because justice should carry awe. When people talk about a judge wearing a wig, it's not to make him anonymous. It's to convey the awful majesty. Law is why the red robes. They were the robes of, if in certain circumstances, death. They are the symbol of the state as monopolizing violence and legitimated violence. All of that we've forgotten. Our courts are shambolic. The buildings that most of them have been used to are architecturally miserable. They are run down. I have friends who've been engaged in civil cases. They describe squalor at the heart of justice rather than majesty. And that, again, we've got to say it, is the result of misplaced liberal conservatism. But it's been made infinitely, infinitely worse under Labour, and even worse with somebody like David Lammy. Can we just talk? I've been holding forth too much. What was your reaction when this man gets up in the House with wearing a shiny suit, without his poppy, famously, and is asked 6 straightforward questions about had there been another escape of a prisoner? He is carrying in his hand the statement which actually has been prepared for him? Because, I mean, can we be quite truthful? It is perfectly clear that nobody in the Cabinet Office trusts Lammy to be able to utter 3 clear, factually based sentences in sequence. He's got a kind of statement it's a kind of statement that a child who is being sent to school, having been off for 2 days, receives from his mummy, which says, Johnny had so and so. It was very sad. There was a doctor. He's there with that, and he doesn't use it. He just blusters. He lies.
I mean, do you know what? I'm going to start with saying that when this government came in to power last year.
Oh, that wonderful moment! The grown-ups are in charge.
Yes,
aren't they?
yes. And of all of them, genuinely, he was the one that I thought, if you were to put money on who's going to lose their position for some fumble, some mishap, he was probably the one that you'd put your money on. So in many ways, I was pleasantly surprised that he's held on this long, that he'd actually managed to outlast a great array of admittedly pretty miserable characters. But nonetheless, he was outperforming what I thought of him. But of course, it was therefore inevitable that something was going to go wrong, and it just so happened that it was after he was shuffled away from the Foreign Office into this new role. I thought it was embarrassing. Frankly, I also thought it was embarrassing, as you say, that nobody trusts David Lammy to sort of utter a statement. But clearly, I don't think he trusts the people behind him, the people that are briefing him either in his position, if he felt confident enough or that he had to just sort of go off of his own volition and try to ad-lib things. Clearly, he doesn't feel entirely secure in what it is that he's being told. And that's sort of what I find very interesting, is that you have a man who clearly thinks that he is superior to everyone in every way. And he's working with a group of people who, because they are civil servants, because they are special advisors, because there is a team behind there, and this is the Labour Party, and this is our civil service, they obviously feel the same way about themselves. And there is a breakdown there in trust between the minister, who is the figurehead, who is the one representing the state. There is a breakdown between him and the state itself, the actual machinations of the government. And of course, further down the line you go, there is the dysfunction, and it is unclear, I think, who answers to who really sets policy, who actually has the information. And I think we should set this against, because, we started off by talking about the general state of justice. But there's another thing, a slightly salacious common theme that's been happening in our prisons in recent years. We've had a lot of people being released accidentally, but there are also an awful lot of cases, and they keep on creeping up, of employees, of prison guards, of prison officers getting involved in drug smuggling, getting involved in inappropriate relations with inmates. This has become a current occurrence of the sort of thing.
Having sex? You mean having sex with inmates? Yeah.
Well, I assume that's what it means. I just sort of see these headlines and think, oh, good Lord.
Well, in fact, it explicitly does. we have video evidence in certain
We do.
cases. I mean, we want to be really... Come on, Benedict. Well, we are grown-ups, remember. We have video evidence of it.
Unless it's on social media, in which case the government will say you can't possibly see this, you can't be trusted, and you have to verify your age. But no, there's been a lot of this sort of stuff going on, and I just think it really speaks to, again, not to bring it back to the broader questions of the breakdown of the state and the role of the state, but the question of who actually is in charge. Is it, who has actually got the authority? And of course, this latest example of a prisoner being released earlier this week, and it turns out that the governor of Wandsworth Prison wasn't there when it happened, because he was off busily investigating another release, I think, of Kadesh Kebatu. He was actually elsewhere investigating that.
Yes, it is at every level, isn't it? That the central machine of the Cabinet Office of Downing Street, down to the individual jail, down to the ministry, down to the communication between the courts and the prisons, which apparently are still done by paper, despite the fact that releases, as it were, take place in real time. You've got the slowness of paper communication and so on. But can we just go back? Because they're the things that I think people, or most people, will have actually noticed, and people will actually have watched, to Lammy's performance in the Commons. And that was extraordinary. I think most extraordinary was that he posted a tweet afterwards, congratulating himself on his performance and on being the first black person to do Prime Minister's questions. Now, imagine you were black, Benedict. What would you feel that is the trophy performance?
I think you can imagine.
He is a figure of fun, isn't he? I mean, this is somebody who is a genuine clown. There is, of course, the famous performance on Mastermind, which I think we should remind ourselves about. This is somebody who, when asked who succeeds Henry VIII, says Henry VII. Now, what mentality does that suggest?
Honestly, it was just it's the sort of thing where you just wonder. It not even would one need a sort of an understanding of history. You wouldn't even need to know the sort of the history of the kings of England. It's a simple numerical issue, and to not be able to sort of put one before the other just strikes you as somebody who, on a fundamental level, shouldn't be in charge of things that require basic things like logic or following patterns. That's a real concern, given that this man has been Foreign Secretary and is now the Lord Chancellor.
And it is two great offices of state being held by somebody that, frankly, if you did that, you imagine one of these things that we give to children, a multi-answer, multi-question test. If a child delivered that, and then he also faced with the choice of who is responsible for the detection of first detects nuclear-style radiation, and he replies Marie Antoinette rather than Marie Curie, and identifies red Leicester as a variety of blue cheese. Now, this is genuinely what in my day used to be called educationally subnormal. And you give somebody successively two of the greatest offices of state. And the result is you have this pantomime. Now, but what again, I want to go back to that phrase that you raised, obviously, right at the beginning, and it was Andrew Marr, wasn't it? The absolute centrist of centrist dads, the point at which the centre-dad spectrum hangs down absolutely dead centre in its impenetrable, I think, pomposity, and we can now see stupidity. We were going to have government that was respectable again. There would be no more Boris Clownshaw. The adults were going to be in charge. The scenes that we've seen since, and I think they genuinely culminate in this. They genuinely culminate in the most I think it must be the most clownish behaviour that the House of Commons has ever seen, and that takes a very great deal. We've had things like the snatching of the mace by Heseltine, we've had bell tolling and all the rest of it, but they were by intelligent men. I will defer for that moment, I'll grant for that moment that title to Heseltine for a particular purpose. This was simply clownish behaviour. But what shocks me more, Benedict, is the absence of consequence. The Speaker summons him to correct. After all, he 6 times lied. He lied 6 times. Conventionally, lying in the House of Commons is a resignation matter. He is summoned to, I think, as a kind of really very mild slap on the wrist to deliver a corrective statement in the House. And he simply refuses, saying, and it's quoted, and it's on the record, that it would be career suicide. And he's allowed to get away with it. I mean, what again does this tell us about his boss? Starmer says famously he's contemptuous of politics and that he much prefers being at Davos to being at Westminster. So we have a prime minister who is openly contemptuous of our machinery of government and leaves as his substitute when he's swanning around at some completely unnecessary event of COP 30 or whatever it's called in Brazil. He leaves this clown behind him.
I do wonder if actually a lot more of this is, of course, to do with the standard and the precedent that has been set by the real man who actually thinks that he is the big man and the dictator in all of this, which is, of course, Keir Starmer, somebody who, let's be clear, if we're accusing David Lammy of lying, of being duplicitous, well, Keir Starmer, I think, has absolutely sort of, set the benchmark very high, to a degree that I think even Alistair Campbell would blush at.
No, now, come on. I've got to hold you to a test of reality, Benedict. But Alistair Campbell blushing, I've heard of many things, but I mean, can we just go back to the point that you were beginning to make? But please repeat it more fully. I mean, let's begin with the beginning. Starmer lies his way to being leader of the Labour Party.
Yes.
And at every subsequent key event, he has lied. This is true, is it not?
Yes.
And the biggest lie, of course, is the one that we should probably move on to now, which is the lie of Labour's promises over tax, that triple promise over tax, that they would not increase either of the three principal rates of taxation, VAT, national insurance or income tax. And now, clearly, they are on the point of increasing one and perhaps two of them. It is simply beyond belief. I mean, can you think of a clearer example, which again is directly quantifiable, of such an absolute, visible, I would use the word brazen breach of a manifesto promise?
I can't think of anything quite as in your face as this. To say, for Rachel Reeves to have been not just in the manifesto, but Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer, many members of the Labour frontbench to have done the broadcast rounds, whilst, of course, they were saying the grown-ups are coming and we are the best prepared government in waiting in history. We've seen the books, we've had years to prepare for this. We know exactly what's happening and there will be no tax rises. To, not even sort of fiddle around the edge. It's going to be straight up income tax that is going to go up, and it's going to be everything else on top of that. But it's, as I say, not even an attempt to try to pull the wool over our eyes or to try to sort of obfuscate or use any kind of clever chicanery. Straightforward. The taxes are going to go up. They're going to hit everybody. We're going to potentially change the definition of a working person to fit our criteria of what's going to happen. Oh, and by the way, we're going to increase things like capital gains along the way. We're going to increase basically, every other sort of duty. Oh, and by the way, that new thing that we're potentially going to have, which is an exit tax, so that if you dare to leave the country, Rachel Reeves will be there at the border. The only person apparently on the border will be Rachel Reeves with a collection tin going, thank you very much for your service. Please leave everything behind. I honestly, other countries have exit taxes. And it is a sign of a country that is terrified. It is never the sign of a country that is particularly prosperous or that is going places. And I think we are about to join the ranks of those nations for whom actually this is all about trying to grab what you can whilst you can. Not about prosperity, not about liberty, no question of that. Things in the mind of this government belong first and foremost to the state, and you almost have them at their benevolence.
It is, isn't it? The fact, manifestly and openly, the state is now parasitic. The services that it delivers, we've been talking about the appalling quality of justice, the spectacular decline in the NHS, the state of roads, simply everywhere you look. This is a state that takes more for delivering less. It also clearly regards property as merely something that is held conditionally, subject to political whim, because this is what we're talking about. The fiddling with tax is merely, it's the Chancellor's whim. There was the famous point made by a Labour Lord Chancellor when the Human Rights Act, when the Human Rights Convention, the European Human Rights Convention, was drawn up in 1951, that the broadness of its wording meant that we'd gone back to the worst of the medieval chancery, where he used that wonderful phrase, the law varied with the length of the Chancellor's foot. We're back now to the stage where taxes vary with the, dare one say it, with the length of the Chancellor's nose. The Pinocchio effect is what we're seeing. And I don't know about you, I find it, once again, I think, yes, it's the brazenness with which Labour has done all of this, the sheer flamboyance of the lies, and of course the repeated lies about little things as well as big things, for everything from Lord Ali to the fact that Rachel Reeves didn't get a rental payment, to the fact that the minister who was in charge of looking after tenants tries to sack tenants so she could jack them. Incident after incident after incident, the response to all of which is just to lie. Just to lie. And we have a speaker who does nothing about it. A speaker, of course, who is clearly, Lindsay Hoyle, is simply in the pocket of the Labour Party. He shows no willingness to enforce authority in the House. He shows, I think, very little understanding of parliamentary procedure. He's a standing disgrace as well. He has reduced Parliament, the prime representative institution in the world, the mother of parliaments now, looks like a tattered whore. And it is shameful. It's shameful. But, Benedict, there's nothing we can do, is there? The problem with our parliamentary constitution is, although we now have this unique spectacle of a government that was elected, whatever it was, less than 18 months ago, with a majority of over 170, is now manifestly falling apart. There is open conversation in the Labour Party about replacing Starmer, probably with something even worse, like Miliband, but there's no means whatever by which it can be brought down, unless the Labour Party itself disintegrates. I mean, we are I think, in a again, I can remember no similar situation, even under Theresa May, when you got the standoff between the government and a House of Commons that decided that it was going to replay the Long Parliament, with John Bercow becoming Speaker Lentil and Dominic Grieve becoming King Pym again. Even then, there was some sort of purpose. There was the two sides were behaving equally disgracefully, in my view, but there was some purpose. This is just a clinging on, hanging on by fingernails as things get worse and worse and worse. Are we just going to have to put up with this for 4 years? As everything gets worse, as the clown show gets worse, as the lies get worse, as Labour, presumably, sinks lower and lower in the polls. It's now fourth.
It's the fascinating situation.
Bridget, come on, your prophecy hat on.
Oh, my prophecy hat on. Well, it's curious, isn't it? Because you've got Nigel Farage, who every time he's asked says he thinks there's going to be a change of government or an election, sort of 2026, maybe 2027 earliest, because he thinks that economic meltdown is inbound. But even then, you're sort of struggling to see how it is that it would be forced. I mean, if you're talking about the collapse of a government, presumably because its own MPs don't have confidence in the Prime Minister and they can't find anybody else that they do find any confidence in. I mean, what is the circumstances under which that actually changes? I'm struggling to see where it is. Does it involve, an IMF bailout? Does it avoid the appointment of technocrats, as we've seen elsewhere? Does it involve the royal family getting involved? Does it involve the monarch? Presumably, we're told at great lengths that the monarch cannot get involved in politics. But here's a serious question, actually, because we all know that Charles is not his mother, and that Charles actually does have political views, and actually, I think, feels quite deeply that his views should be listened to, and is sort of looking for a role of the monarchy. Is it entirely out of the question that you could perhaps have a set of circumstances where the monarch sort of very gently leans on the Prime Minister and says, now look here, I know that the numbers are entirely in your favour, but nothing is working here, and this is going to be a disaster. Might it not be the thing for you to do the decent thing and call a general election, rather than drag the country through however many more years of this torment? I mean, many people will say it would be outrageous to happen, but is it completely inconceivable? I don't think so.
Again, unless extraordinary circumstances happen, we wouldn't know, because it would, in fact, be entirely legitimate for a monarch to say that in the privacy of the weekly audience. That it would be entirely appropriate for the monarch to say that. The issue becomes if the Prime Minister says no, and the monarch feels so strongly about it that they either go public with the advice, or they actually and order the issuing of the writs. Now, that is where I start to stutter, for the very good reason. I think that the machinery of the Lord Chancellor's Department, which in theory is responsible for the issuing of the writs, the whole business of the dissolution of a parliament, I doubt if it would actually obey a direct instruction from the monarch. I mean, you're now looking to things which have not been done since the 18th century. On the other hand, I can see, a crisis of the British state that exceeds anything that has happened since the 17th, the late 17th century. We seem to me to be heading to a crisis in the basic function of the state. Well, I fear one is tempted to use words like the personal rule of Charles I. The fact that and then the issue was not the malfunction of the state, arguably, it was a state that was doing too much against the wishes of a significant and powerful part of the political nation. But we're seeing something much more like, and if I'm called upon to produce historical analogies, it's much more like what happens to government in the 15th century. It's very similar to one of those long confidence-dissolving reigns like a Henry VI. I think Starmer is very much like one of those bad medieval monarchs. The general disintegration of the whole machine of government is the sort of thing that we saw for long stretches of the 15th century. Correcting it was profoundly difficult. Even the circumstances, the only circumstances in which I could see, going back to your scenario, supposing the IMF is called in. Now, the friend with whom I toured the country, Mark Littlewood, with Popcon, did a very interesting calculation. I'd like to run it past you. He looked at the last time this happened, 1976, which of course is that crucial moment in the disintegration of the last lethal Labour regime, when the IMF is summoned in. He pointed out that when the IMF had to deal with the catastrophe, again the increase of taxation, where Dennis Healey takes it up to 83, and if you looked at the very top rate, 98%, the entire proportion of the reserves of the IMF that were involved in 76 was 10%. He's calculated that if you look at our equivalent obligations now, it would be 50%. Now that's unthinkable. So presumably, if there were to be an IMF intervention, it wouldn't be the sort of relatively gentle thing that happened in 1976. It would be much more like, and this again is a measure of shame, it would be much more like the treatment of Greece and Ireland, or indeed the actual introduction of commissioners. In other words, compulsory changes of policy. Now, I think in those circumstances, the scenario you're talking about is real. The question is whether we think we're yet at that point.
I'd say not just now, but I think what we're both sort of getting at is you can see a scenario in which it does happen, and it's difficult to see the forks in the road where you can avoid getting to that without something slightly dramatic or unexpected happening, like, for instance, the Labour government deciding to massively cut spending on things, which it's made very clear that their own backbenchers want them to do. Exactly. I mean, chance would be a fine thing that they would do the sensible thing that everybody is shouting for them to do. It's far more likely that they will simply close their eyes, block their ears, and walk us into a scenario like that. But I mean, it's interesting you're talking about the IMF, because there have also been suggestions, of course, that France and other European countries may need assistance from the IMF. And when we're talking about these sorts of funds, we'd be talking about the United Kingdom, or possibly France, requiring more money from the IMF than countries like Pakistan or Ukraine currently get from the IMF. That's to put it into some sort of context of how bad this would be. But I just put this to you. Is there a world in which, perhaps, where taking patriotism out of the equation, actually, from a practical political perspective, a number of parties in this country might quite like the idea of an IMF bailout, of commissioners and technocrats being appointed, and of things being taken out of the hands of elected politicians, because then they aren't the ones that have to do the dirty work. They aren't the ones that have to get their hands unclean. Could this, in fact, be of benefit to, say, perhaps not the Labour Party, obviously they'll be blamed, but say an insurgent party on the right like Reform, or indeed an insurgent force on the left like the Greens, which, to be clear, I think is another clown show, but doesn't have that same sort of tarnish as the Labour government does, and is rising in the
Yes.
polls as we speak.
Yes, I mean, you can see, of course, it also has the wonderful effect that not simply wouldn't you carry the blame for it, you would actually be able to blame them for it. Particularly, you could see the kind of field day that somebody like Zach Polanski would have in these circumstances. You know, the IMF as the wicked emissaries of the billionaire class, you know, inflicting this monstrous suffering upon the decent British people who, you know, we've got to have a new left-wing patriotism that rises against the internet. You can just see that you could write the script now. But then, of course, it would be an even worse clown show. I suppose, I hate saying this, but I think one just has to sit back and treat it as a theatre of the absurd. We are watching this extraordinary performance. You know, there is a flavour, isn't there, of those last days of Rome, where we were talking about Lammy in the position of Cardinal Wolsey or in the position of Thomas More. It's a bit like, you know, that last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, that echo of the beginning of the Republic, Romulus, Augustulus, little Augustus, the beginning of the empire. There is that awful sense, isn't there, as these clowns sit in the seats of the great, because Lammy, as Foreign Secretary, was, of course, in the same seat as Palmerston, you know, as Palmerston. And we watch and commentate, and there's really not very much to do. Don't you get a bit depressed? I mean, I'm a sort of hyperactivist, and I go out and talk and say there are things that we can do, but of course there are things that we can do subject to another general election, and that is this 4 years.
I tend to get very depressed about it, but I've always been very cynical about politics and the nature of politics in this country, and I'm the same as you in that actually I do fear that it is 3.5+ years until we get the opportunity to change, and then who knows? Frankly, given the way that elections go, and it's foolish to try to predict these things, you never know whether or not you'll actually get a scenario that improves the situation. In fact, the pattern in this country for decades has been that we consistently make things worse because of the options that are put on the table for us. I mean, we've not got a huge amount of time left, but there's two little things that I want to pick up on, talking about, the theatre of the absurd. One is, of course, and you have alluded to it, you've touched upon it, which is our esteemed Prime Minister deciding to take this particular moment to do what he always does when things get very bad and jet off somewhere else, so he doesn't have to think about it. And he's currently at COP, ostensibly there to save the planet in the way that he only ever makes things better, of course. So given that he's there to save the planet, presumably now he's just cut the amount of time we all have on it short by another 10 years. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on very quickly, it's impossible to avoid American politics in this country. We do live downstream of it. What do you make of the election of Zohan Mamdani? This, people sort of dance around what he is. He's a socialist. He is a socialist who has refused to condemn the concept of Sharia law, who has said things that are quite clearly overtly anti-Semitic in relation to Israel and the Israel Defense Forces. What do you make of the election of this man, the very embodiment of the sort of the liberal American college campus, becoming mayor of New York, only 25 years after 9/11? Try and get your brain around that for just, for the 5 minutes or so that we have left.
Well, for heaven's sake, look at our own mayor in London. After the Islamic atrocities of 20 years ago. We are seeing, and again, there are different ways of describing it. One interesting way of describing the phenomenon on both sides of the Atlantic, with Khan here, but of course very, very similar politics in a more eloquent and forceful fashion from Zach Balansky, is called third worldism. It's this bizarre alliance of, on the one hand, the Muslim radical, the Islamist, with the ultra-leftist and the ultra-greenist. It is a kind of I suppose it's again going back to mayors and mayors of London. It's going back to the original Rainbow Coalition that was envisaged by Ken Livingstone, but on steroids. And of course, with the vastly more powerful driving element of the Muslim vote. But the Muslim vote combined with essentially the alienated young graduate vote. This is clearly one of the dominant aspects of this. I mean, if you look at the towns which are liable to this kind of thing, you have on the one hand some of the poorest and some of the richest. You look at Brighton, you look at Bristol, where there, of course, it's the graduate class, the educated class, because I think he doesn't quite say it directly, but George Orwell has that brilliant formulation that many things are so completely ridiculous that only the highly educated can possibly believe them, and it is this weird combination, and you can see it as infinitely more effective than the dead machine of Brownite and Blairite Labourism. I think it is very likely to look like the opposition that will face a reformed government at the moment. If you look at the current opinion polls, they suggest in this country that I mentioned the fact that the last opinion poll shows Labour as fourth. Then you have the Conservatives. Then you have the Greens. Then you have Reform. But the Lib Dems, although they come lower in terms of overall percentage, because their vote is concentrated, at the moment it looks as though they would form the main opposition to a reform government. I think that's very likely to change under the impact of the things we've been talking about now. I think that a lot of the soft Conservative vote, which has gone to the Lib Dems, will peel off as the tax measures of the Labour Party bite harder and harder and harder. I think the Liberal Conservative vote is the comfortable vote. And as these people cease to be comfortable, they will peel off. So we'll have a much more clearly, of course, much more polarized politics. We will see the death of the old, what you could call the centre parties, the Union Party, and you will have Reform on the one hand, and you will have Zach Polanski-style Greens or Mandami-style Greens on the other, with this extraordinary essence of Islam, an essence of Islamism driven into it. It is itself, of course, profoundly unstable. Profoundly unstable. I think that that Khan has been able to escape much of this in London, because, of course, the powers of the Mayor of London are so much more restricted. I think that the fact that a Mayor of New York has got a much wider range of powers, the tensions within that extraordinary coalition will become clearer. In other words, this is a very long-winded way of saying that I think the same forces that powered Mandami in America are powering people like Zach Polanski here, and we will see more of it.
David, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Hopefully, we'll get to do this again one day, and it might be positive. There may be some upbeat news for us to talk about. Maybe we won't have been embarrassed on the international stage by any one of our elected politicians. I doubt it'll happen anytime soon, but it would be very nice if we did get that opportunity at some point. But thank you very much for having me, and thank you to everybody who's taken the time to listen to this, and I'm sure we'll all see you again soon.
We will, but, I fear it will be another clown show. Thank you.
Thank you.